work done, we see things like electrolytes and your cholesterol and triglycerides and the different ratios and your level of iron and hematocrit and hemoglobin and all those different things. I'll do this for the camera. So the way this normally works is you take a population of people and you start charting out where they are in the range, and you'll get a bell curve. And then they cut off 1 or 2 standard deviations too high, 1 or 2 standard deviations too low, and what's left is now the reference range. That's a huge amount of how these reference ranges are developed. Now, as well as research is done, say, well, for ideal health, this should be a little lower, this should be a little higher. But a huge part of how reference ranges are developed is what I just described. Now, but that's for average people, eating a typical Western diet, not exercising so much, some of them are smoking cigarettes. And when someone's eating a much different diet and leading a much different lifestyle, some parameters of their blood chemistry may be markedly different. So that's when the raw foodists say, well, none of those lab tests matter because, it's for average people who aren't healthy. Well, that's a good point. There's only so far that the range of healthy human physiology can go. Right? So there's only so much of a range. So let's say for diet, we can eat fruit, we can eat vegetables, we can have some gourmet things. None of us are going to do well on tree bark. Okay, that's just too far outside of our range. So the same thing with normal blood work parameters. Some things just can't go too far. So I want to touch on a few of those and discuss what things we may not want to be in the normal range for, but what other things we do want to be in the normal range for. Okay, and one of the things that now that we've just recently finished our 2 newest classes of Living Life that you've got on the flyer there, our Science of Raw Food Nutrition Level 3 and our Advanced Educator course. Now that those courses and our really solid curriculum is developed, we're going to start to write some books and have some e-books and have some online courses and venture out into expanding our career. One of the things I'm going to be doing is doing lab work consulting with people. So we can set up, so I can send you a form and you can go to your local lab and have some blood work done. You can also do some specialized testing. And also for people who have had some blood chemistry work done and maybe their doctor's too busy to explain it all to them, or they want to get a professional's opinion with a little different education and background than their typical medical practitioner, I'm going to be offering those services. So thought it would be useful to talk about a few of those things tonight. So one of the things that we typically see on a blood chemistry profile is you'll see what's called your electrolytes. And those are sodium and potassium and chloride, as well as calcium ions. And what these things are in a nutshell is they are charged particles that run back and forth across our cell membranes, creating the electrical activity that makes our nerve cells operate, that makes our muscles operate. And basically without electrolytes, your nerves don't work and your muscles don't work, nothing happens, you're dead. So you need to have electrolytes in just the right range. Now it's interesting, sodium is one of the key electrolytes. Now whether you're on a typical American diet and you're eating 3,500 to 5,000 milligrams of sodium, or you're on a really more simplified fruit and vegetable diet where you don't add any salt, where you're only getting maybe 500 milligrams of sodium a day just from what's naturally in the fruits and vegetables, whether you're at one extreme or the other, your sodium level in your blood needs to be right in the middle of the reference range. If your sodium's too low, you've got a problem. You're either starving somehow, you've been fasting, water fasting too long, or you've got some kind of major kidney issue, which is going to be a medical concern. Now that's extremely rare that we ever see that, but nevertheless, sometimes if someone is in that situation and they just said the reference ranges don't count, they're not going to seek the appropriate health care that they require, and people can get themselves into trouble. In fact, I worked for 4 years at a water fasting center, a place where people would save up their 2 weeks vacation and come pay us to not feed them. Not most people's idea of a great vacation, but what I saw consistently and routinely there is people actually recover from type 2 diabetes, from high blood pressure, from cardiovascular disease, from various forms of autoimmune disease, things that can be rather debilitating like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and ulcerative colitis, when they were oftentimes told, there's nothing we can do, you'll be on this medication for the rest of your life. For those particular conditions and a few others, I saw people recover consistently and predictably. It's really great. So some good things can happen. So even on a water fast, you don't want your sodium levels to get too low. They can get a little bit low, but you don't want them to get too low. If they get too low, we need to intervene and break your fast and give you some juices to make sure that all those electrolytes are in just the right range. So let's look at some other things that can be actually a little bit different. Let's look at something all of us are familiar with, the cholesterol level, right? Usually when you go to your doctor, they'll do a lipid profile, they'll check your cholesterol and the different fractions of cholesterol as well as your triglycerides. So usually what they'll tell you is if your total cholesterol is less than 200, that's great. Now in the United States, it may just be changing. Cancer, so heart disease is declining a little bit, so cancer at some point may be the #1 cause of death in the United States. But as of the most current statistics, heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States. A couple hundred years ago, did anybody on the planet get heart disease? Almost nobody. It was really unknown. Our genetics haven't changed in 200 years, but our diets and lifestyles certainly have. So that's the #1 cause of disease. And cause of death, excuse me. Does anyone know what the average cholesterol level of somebody in the United States is? Good guess, right? You might think in the upper 200s or something like that. It's actually 211. So if you get down to, say, 195, you're not that much different than the person who has about a 40% chance of dying prematurely from cardiovascular disease. You might be down to a 30% chance. That's certainly a significant improvement, but I mean, if I had a whatever you call it, a 6-shooter gun, and I put 2 bullets in there, so you've got a 1/3 chance of dying if you pull the trigger, would anyone feel comfortable playing Russian roulette like that? I think that's still much too high. So really, if you look around the world at the populations that don't get heart disease, and if you look at studies like the Framingham Heart Study, that's been conducted outside of Boston, Massachusetts since 1948, and you start to put some things together, what you find is that if someone's average cholesterol is 150 or less throughout their lifetime, their chances of getting heart disease is basically negligible. So really, if your doctor says this is your cholesterol is 180, that's good, you might want to reconsider that and work on getting it down below 150. That's ideally where it should really be. Then there's the ratios, and that gets a little more complex. Another thing you can look at as part of the heart disease risk profile is known as your triglycerides. And basically that's just the way that fat is transported through our bloodstream and stored in our fat cells. So all else being equal, the higher level of triglycerides in your bloodstream, the worse, and the lower, the better. Typically, in a blood chemistry profile, they say somewhere between, say, 50 and 150 is optimal. From what I've seen clinically, 150 is a little bit high. I'd really like to see that below 100. I can remember one time when the lab I went to, the reference range was 35 to 150. And my triglycerides that time were 32. So that was abnormal. But in that case, that was good. I was happy to be abnormal because there was an example where I didn't want to be like the average normal person. I've had times when, now the cholesterol level ranges go pretty low, but I can remember times when the cholesterol level, the reference range was say 130 to 220 or whatever was considered good, and mine was 125. Well, I wasn't too worried about that. They do say sometimes some of the anti-vegan folks will tell you that if your cholesterol gets too low, you have increased risk for stroke and depression and various other issues. And, really, they never tell you what the number is. They just say too low. What's too low? Nobody knows. It's that stuff that filters around the internet. In fact, we just read a recent study, what was that, from 2010? The Seventh-day Adventist study, where they looked at omnivorous Seventh-day Adventists versus vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists. And the vegetarian ones with lower cholesterol, when they had them fill out surveys where they got what they call a mood scale, they found that the people with lower cholesterol actually had better moods and more positive attitudes than the people with higher cholesterol. So unless you've got some type of major liver disease, which is pretty darn rare, the lower the better.